This is Chapter 8 on state bureaucracies. Let's get into the questions. First one is define bureaucracy and identify some of its roles in a political system. Well, here on the right, or I should say on the left, we'll start with is a definition, and on the right is the roles of the bureaucracy. By way of definition, I would say, and this is my own definition, not what you'd find in the book. Bureaucracy is the personnel and the agencies responsible for administering public policy. So if ever you have a law or a policy that's designed by an executive branch, it has to be administered. And the people who do that, the agencies and the people who do it, are what we call the bureaucracy. And it's characterized by the following things. You'll see other kinds of characteristics like chain of command and militaristic like organizational structure. But what I have here is some other characteristics that I think are more important. The first would be that it's a permanent branch. In other words, if you look at the political branches, you essentially have the legislature and the executive, and the people there come and go. They, they're elected and they choose oftentimes not to get reelected. And regardless of that, whether they, decide they want to run again, they're not very permanent. You have different governors, different members of the legislature all the time. Every couple of years or so when they hold an election, there's changes. But bureaucracy is different. The bureaucracy is a permanent branch. People are there essentially much like they would be in the private sector, maybe even more so these days in the 21st century. They stay in the bureaucracy. So whether it's the post office or the Justice Department or streets and sanitation, it's made up of people who tend to be there in the job and stay in the job. The second thing is that they tend to be more professional. The political branches are made up of people who are just citizens, what Ronald Reagan labeled as citizen politicians. That is, they're people who have no real experience or background in government or in the job they're doing. It's just, getting citizens, much like you would in a jury, putting a jury together. It's just citizens. It's not anything to do with people who know what they're doing when it comes to the law. But the bureaucracy is the opposite. It's professional. People there are trained in public administration or some related field, and they're considered to be, if not experts, at least skilled in the background of what they're doing. Again, depending on, whether that's social work or building roads or education or what have you. There are people with a professional background. And they're non-political appointees. Most of the people in the bureaucracy, the permanent bureaucracy, are people who have passed an exam or shown some qualifications to hold the office. It's kind of the opposite of what you'd find in what we call patronage jobs, where people get appointments because of political ties, because of things like how much money they contributed, or how much work they've done for a political party or a candidate, and that's how they get appointed in what we call patronage jobs. So this is the opposite of that. It's non-political appointees. So that's how I would define bureaucracy. Those characteristics and the definition I gave of personnel and agencies responsible for carrying out the laws or the public policies. What are the roles? Look at the right there, you can see the list. they implement policies and laws. So if there's a policy, they're expected to carry it out. So um, if the Congress passes a law, or I should say, we should focus on the state legislature, any legislature, they have to have somebody to carry it out, no matter what it is. For example, like if you look at something like the idea that we would have charter schools, that's a kind of local or state concept that's been carried out for quite some years now, where schools would be no longer the typical public school where you have it run by the Department of Education in the state. A charter school would be independent. It would be privately run. It would, in other words, a private sector would hire the teachers and build the school and all the rest of the kind of things that go with having a school. And they would decide who gets in, who gets to come to the charter school. So the bureaucracy, if the state says, okay, we're going to have charter schools, the bureaucracy is needed to implement that, to decide all the kind of things that I just mentioned, like who would get in, who would build the school, how much would it cost, who would run it, how would the teachers be hired, etc. The second thing is that it can be characterized as handling the day-to-day business of government. So whatever has to be implemented, it's going to be the bureaucracy. They make policy. Also, the bureaucracy, a role of the bureaucracy is to make policy within the guidelines set by the legislature. So if you take anything like No Child Left Behind, and if you look at that as a policy that was passed by the national government under President Bush, the second President Bush. And what was it? What was No Child Left Behind? Well, it was a policy that said we're going to have national standardized tests for all grade school and high school kids, and we're going to have standardized tests for all grade school and high school teachers. And so, again, if you do something like that, and that's about as far as the law goes, then you need the bureaucracy to put flesh onto those skin and bones. In other words, somebody has to carry it out. Somebody has to decide, what does that mean? What test? Who's going to make up the test? And how do you score the test? And so on and so forth. All of that stuff is making policy within the guideline. So the guideline is No Child Left Behind, testing, and so then within that framework, the bureaucracy would then decide the specifics of it, the kind of what I call the day-to-day business, deciding what the test would be and what a score would be to pass and so on. And the last thing in terms of roles of the bureaucracy is to advise public officials. Since they're considered to be professionals and been around for a while and experts, and oftentimes politicians are not, they tend to be unskilled unless they've served for a long period of time. They learn on the job. It's oftentimes the bureaucracy that tells them what the law is and what they have to do under the law. So that's what I mean by advising public officials. Number two is, why is there such a large bureaucracy? And bureaucracy gets a bad name because it's so big. So whether you're talking about a police department in the city of Chicago, or the numbers of people that are needed to run the county jail in Chicago, any of those kind of things, people in streets and sanitation, all of those get a kind of bad name because they're large. They get to be big. Well, why does the bureaucracy grow so much? Why there's so many public employees in these administrative buildings when you walk through the state capitol, whether you're in Springfield or you're in Santa Fe. It seems like the bureaucracy outnumbers the political people. So why is that? Well, one reason is because there's so many laws and so many policies. As long as public officials are going to create new laws, as long as they're going to create new policies, and it seems like that happens all the time, that means there's going to be additions to the bureaucracy. So think of it that way, that every time they pass a new law, they need to hire new people to implement those things. So the only way you could stop the bureaucracy from getting bigger is if you stop making new policies and new laws, and that's never going to happen. A second thing is you have a large bureaucracy because there's a desire for an impersonal approach. Examples would be public safety, like police, and education, like teachers. We don't want political appointees to be running the police department or or educating our kids. So what we do is we demand that they be hired in a professional way. That is, that they have certain credentials, that they pass certain tests, and so on. Another thing is a desire for equal treatment. The bureaucracy is kind of the opposite. The way they operate, at least the way they're supposed to operate, is no political clout. Not to use political clout. Like in Chicago, and I lived in Chicago for a long time, it's pretty evident that there's clout everywhere. There isn't almost any job in the city that you can get without having some political connections to the Democratic Party of Chicago. So we don't, in general, we don't like that kind of thing. We don't want to just see Democrats be teachers or cops or street cleaners or whatever. And we don't want to see like when it snows, that only the people who get their streets cleaned are people who are loyal to the Democratic Party. We want to see equal treatment, especially in the justice system. And because we don't get that very often, for a variety of reasons, and maybe we'll talk about some of those when we get to the courts, the criticism of the court system is paramount. We're very, very critical of what's going on in the court system because of that, because we're trying to eliminate clout. The culture says in the 21st century that everything should be run professionally and there should be equal treatment, that sort of thing. Also, there's a desire, the last one is that there's a desire for a permanent branch in the face of an ever-changing political branches. There's a sense that the bureaucracy can bring about stability in the government when you get people who come in office who are inexperienced. You know, I've never seen in my entire time on this earth, I've never seen a reaction that we've gotten to a president like Trump. And part of the reason is because he has no experience in government. But one of the things that keeps him in check is the bureaucracy, the permanent branch. And people like that idea that there would be these experts in the background who make sure that the president or the governor or whoever it is that takes over with no experience, that they don't really make fundamental mistakes. Number three is, what are the problems of a bureaucracy in a democracy? So if you've got this permanent branch and you've got people professionally chosen instead of politically chosen, as a democracy would demand, the democracy demands that all public officials, whatever branch they're in, be chosen by the public. And here we have this bureaucracy, and as I said, all its characteristics are sort of undemocratic. They're not chosen by the people in any way. So what are some of the problems that the bureaucracy faces in a democracy. Well, the first one is red tape, that there's too many rules that makes the system slow. That's the fundamental criticism of businesses about bureaucracy. That is that they're forced to fill out so many forms and live up to so many expectations of rules and regulations that they can't really run their business. So that's the kind of criticism that's made, that the red tape is too much, that in an effort to um, provide equal treatment and to be objective, they've made the rules too rigorous. The second thing is that the rules can be draconian, that's to say too harsh, that they're very tough. Like, for example, when we got fed up with street crime back in the it really started in the 70s, went through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now into the 21st century. One of the things that happened somewhere along the way, probably around 2000, was that there was a realization that a law like three strikes and you're out, which exists in many states as well as the national government, was too harsh, because if people committed a third felony, even if it was a sort of what you would call a minor felony, like stealing something that didn't seem to be very important, as long as you got that third strike, you had to serve long prison sentences. So it can get too harsh, and we realize that, and now we're starting to trim that down. So that's another problem. A third problem is that there's too many officials. Again, like I said, if you go to Springfield or you come to Santa Fe, you'll see that it looks like, at least from the size of the buildings and the number of people walking around, that bureaucrats way outnumber the political people, and there's just too many of them. Sometimes you'll see that in terms of operation, like you go to the post office, there are constant criticism of the workers there, that it seems like they're not working fast enough or taking too many breaks or something, that doesn't seem like the system's working very well. Another criticism is that it's too hard to fire incompetent officials. That is, once you hire somebody and they've served for a number of years, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. At least that's the criticism, and there's some truth to that. Another thing, of course, is that it's wasteful. That, like if you look at budgets and the amount of money that's being spent by individual departments and agencies within the bureaucracy, there's a tendency for them to spend all their money and then ask for more, rather than to try and be cost efficient. And then finally, the policy is made by non-elected officials, so it's not democratic. So when you take any policy area, within the policy area, as I mentioned, like with No Child Left Behind, that the bureaucratic officials really kind of decide what the policy is going to be, and that's not democratic. Okay, so the last one is, what gives the bureaucracy power? And the answer to that is little or no supervision. We don't have enough policing of the bureaucracy to know that they're really doing their job. Like I said, the legislature can hold hearings and hold public officials to account, but the actual effort to try and see to it that in the day-to-day operation everybody's doing what they're supposed to is very hard to do. Like, for example, when I gave you that example of the speed limits, there's no way that the federal government could have supervised every police department in the country to see to it that they were keeping everybody to a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And it's like that with everything. Education, for example, whatever it is. When the Supreme Court handed out a mandate to the public officials at the local level to integrate public schools, That really was never done. And once in a while there would be court cases, but for the most part, most of the many thousands of school districts in the United States went were ignored. If you another example would have been when the Supreme Court said that you couldn't pray in public schools. Well, in the Bible Belt, they did plenty of praying, and nobody ever checked them on it unless there would be some kind of a court case. And those are far and few between because most people can't afford to take a case to the Supreme Court. So the end result was they just pretty much do what they want, just like the police did what they wanted in the, 55-mile-an-hour case. There just isn't supervision. The second thing is the legislative expectations. The legislature will set general rules and expect the bureaucracy to do what it wants, but it can't go much further than that. It can't really take the power away from the bureaucracy. It just doesn't have the personnel to do it. And it also oftentimes doesn't have the expertise to do it. It's like if you have the bureaucracy that puts the budget together, there's probably only a handful of people in the whole department that really understand it, and most political people don't. So it's not uncommon, for example, for the legislature at the national level, state level, local level, whatever it is, to pass a budget and not really know what's in it. It just becomes very complicated. Ambiguity of the law gives the bureaucracy power because oftentimes it doesn't say much. The laws really don't explain how it's supposed to be done, like the No Child Left Behind example I gave you. It becomes up to the bureaucracy to decide what it really means. And that's gives them a lot of power. So think of it as power within the context of the law that's been passed. Most laws are general in nature, and the specifics, the day-to-day operation, who gets the money, who gets the benefits, and so on, is all determined by the bureaucracy. Another thing is that the bureaucracy has a lot of loyalty of its members to the agency or the organization rather than to the government in general or the executive that is in charge at the top level. So the bureaucracy oftentimes gets its own loyalty. I remember, for example, when President Reagan was president back in the 80s, he promised one of the things he was going to do was to get rid of the Department of Education. He said that they didn't need a national department and we could get rid of it. Well, the Department of Education still stands, even though Reagan was there for 8 years trying to get rid of them. Why? Because there was a great deal of loyalty on the part of the people who worked there to keep the organization going. They thought it had real significance and real meaning rather, opposite of what President Reagan thought. And so they did everything they could to stay in business, including trying to get interest groups like teachers' organizations to support them. And they won out in the end. Like I said, the political people tend not to be around very long, 8 years at the most or so, and then they're out, whether that's a governor or a president. And the bureaucrats are more permanent. And then the last thing that gives them power is the perceived professionalism. That is to say, they're seen as non-political and they're seen as trained and expert in their areas. So that helps them. If you look at like a city council, the bureaucrats who come in to talk to the city council about a tax reform or building a building or whatever it has, whatever you have, they tend to really win the day because most public officials don't have background, don't have experience. A lot of times at the local level, they don't even have education. That is, they're not college educated. And so the end result is that whatever the public officials, bureaucratic public officials say, they tend to buy. So they're very um, the bureaucracy becomes very powerful because of their perceived expertise, their perceived professionalism. Okay, I hope all of that helped.